Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. I'm David Suddjian, and Bird Bombs is brought to you by the Denver Field Ornithologists. Bird Bombs is a 30-minute burst of info on a focused ID topic. I'll give a presentation, and we'll have some quizzes, and I'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. Laura Stedman is assisting tonight, monitoring our chat and Q&A. So please send any questions or comments our way, and she can help present those to me at the end. So tonight, Bird Bombs is looking at sparrows, particularly fall sparrows. Let's look at sparrow ID in the Denver metro region along the Front Range during this fall migration time. And so we're talking about the period of August to November. Now we're already past August, but when we think about fall migration for sparrows, that's what we're thinking about. And, there's a lot of different sparrows that we can encounter right now, and they are the LBJs, the little guys, and they are brown, and they are little jobs that get away in the vegetation before we can see them well all too often. So we want to learn what is the way to approach their ID. And tonight we'll focus on some of the New World sparrows, and we're talking about the family Passerellidae. In some of your books, you might find sparrows listed in the family Emberizidae. Right now, they're listed separately in the family considered separately in Passerellidae. So these are the New World sparrows, and it's a big family worldwide, almost all in the New World. There's 138 species, and indeed we have 32 different species that have been recorded here in Colorado. So that's a lot of different sparrows, and we're not going to talk about all of those tonight, but there are a few ones that you can encounter right now, even somewhat commonly, such as the Savannah sparrow or the Vesper sparrow or the lark bunting yet. But these guys in just a little bit are going to be out of here as we get a little further into September, and we can't deal with everything tonight. So we are going to focus on 10 focal species. And so you can see I've got them arranged here in groupings according to genus. So it's very useful to consider the genera of the sparrows and what genus a particular species is in, because they have some commonalities, and it helps you when you're even just looking at one briefly. That's a Spizella, that's a Melaspiza, that's a Zonotrichia, and it can help you just sort things out. So in our four groups here, we do have 3 species in the Spizella group: the chipping, clay-colored, and Brewer sparrows. And then in its own genus here, used to be a Spizella, or in that genus is the American tree sparrow, our only Spizaloides species. And then we have 3 species in the Zonotrichia genus. And so we have the white crown, and then 2 that we really love to see, the Harrises and white-throated sparrows. And then 3 Melaspiza sparrows, song lichens, and swamp sparrow. So notice I've highlighted 3 of these species. And these ones I want you to pay attention to as reference species. These are the most common, and they're ones you gotta be really familiar with to help you in considering the other species, and even in picking out other species than I have listed here. So those are the ones you really want to be especially familiar with. And you have a lot of opportunities because they are very numerous. When you're looking for sparrows, you want to find areas that have open areas along edges with shrubs, weedy areas, field margins, all kinds of things like that, fence lines in sunflower and weedy patches. Basically, if you put together wet, weedy, and willows, you'll get really good sparrow opportunities a lot of the time. So we need to know what we want to look at when we're looking at sparrows. And I would suggest that right away, when you have the opportunity presented with you, a bird pops up, flies in and lands, take a look at the face and the breast, or underparts generally. Those are important ID areas. Sometimes the bird's facing away and you want to, it's going to turn its head and you're going to get a glimpse of the face, and it's going to give you important clues about eye lines, eye rings, colors there on the face, particular contrast. And then also the underparts. Are there streaks or not? What are the colors on the underparts? Beige, gray, buff. And is there a central breast spot? So we have some bird nerd talk here in the middle, and those are things we want to those are some terms we want to at least know about as we as we consider our sparrow ID, and you're going to encounter them in various descriptions that you'll see. So some of them are pretty self-explanatory. I do want to point out the lore. If I'm looking at my left-hand picture here, and my mouse is pointing here between the eye and the upper part of the bill, this is the lore, or the loral area, or loral region, and that's an important area to be aware of. And then over alongside of that, this malar stripe or malar line is this white area, and it's bordered by dark often on sparrows that show a malar line, and those have fancy names, and so there's a lot of terms here. You can just think about an upper border and a lower border, not worry about moustachial stripe and lateral throat stripe and so on. Over here on this top bird, consider the supercilium is this eyebrow that's above an eye line. And the eye line here continues all the way through the eye and actually divides an eye ring into two eye arcs. And this is an auricular patch. And so here, this one has a poorly defined malar, and those streaks or stripes along the side are not as bright as the other bird we were looking at. So sometimes there's a complete eye ring, or it might be divided by the eye line into two eye arcs and be less prominent. So you can see in the lower right picture of a song sparrow, this median crown stripe, lateral crown stripe, supercilium, eye line with eye arcs, a gray auricular patch, a white or whitish malar, and this lower border or lateral throat stripe that broadens out. So all those different marks there. So it's important to know a little bit about molt all the time when you're considering birds, especially in migratory times. And adult sparrows undergo a complete post-breeding molt in July to September. And at that time, the adults go from looking scruffy to eventually spanky. And the one that we see that with most often is a song sparrow that's common. And by after the breeding season, by late July and through August, the adults become hard to find, but they also become real scruffy looking. The picture on the left shows an adult with a new fledgling who's actually pretty neat compared to the adult who's starting to look a little messy, and some other pictures of molting adults. So it's important to consider that. Our juvenile sparrows mostly molt before we see them during migration time. Chipping sparrow is an exception. So we see juvenile sparrows are very streaky underneath, or are streaky as a rule, and the chipping sparrow retains those streaks when it gets to us. So here's our three Spizella species, and we have the chipping sparrow, which we can see in some sizable numbers, and it's kind of the prime Spizella sparrow, and we can see on the eBird bar chart that it has a strong presence through the entire time from about mid-spring into October. And then the two other species, the clay-colored sparrow, which we see in smaller numbers, and the Brewer sparrow in similar numbers to the clay-colored, both have these migratory pulses, but the Brewer's does breed in the metro region and in the Front Range, and at various local spots. And the at this time, looking in the fall, we both see they have a pulse that comes on through. And on this graph of frequency, you can see the chipping sparrow is far and away the most frequent and also the most numerous, as it turns out. And the other two, though, have a similar overall frequency and abundance. And you can see the Brewers moving through a little bit earlier in the season than the clay-colored. All right, so chipping sparrows, chippers pass through in good-sized flocks, and we see both adults, mostly in non-breeding plumage by this time of year, certainly, although in early August or so you can see others that are still bright, like the one on the left-hand side is an alternate or breeding plumaged adult. And this one to the center here, to the right of that, is a non-breeding plumaged adult. And you can kind of compare and see the crown has gotten darker, and there's some other changes that we'll look at in a sec. But there's also these streak birds, which are very prominent. Here's a brand new fledgling on the lower left, not fully developed in some ways, still with that nice pale gape, but they doesn't look a whole lot different from these juveniles that we see now. So the chipping sparrow, like the other Spizellas, these are small little sparrows. And on the chipping, notice that the dark eyeline is prominent on the face with thin white eye arcs. That eyeline shoots right across and divides into two eye arcs. And there's a sort of a malar there, but it's not very contrasty, and sometimes it's not too prominent, particularly on the adults. And the lores are dark from that eye line that's proceeding across, so that's important. They're fairly bright above. The adult, like I say, is clear-breasted, not as bright as in the breeding plumage, but the juvenile is streaky underneath, and it's the only of the Spizella that has significant streaking. A few times you'll see one of the others retaining some small amounts of streaking, but it's not the same effect at all. So they have also streaked little fine streaks in the brown crown. And here's a beautiful juvenile chippy, and you can see how gorgeous they really are. And these are small, little, delicate birds, and we see these Spizellas in flocks that are down, often where we don't even see them feeding among the grasses, and they'll flush up in 1, 2, 10, 20, there's 5 more, and there's a lot of them. And you get a little chance when they land somewhere, maybe, to get a look, because when they land in the trees or shrubs, they want to go and hide right away. So you have to be persistent in really following up to get some decent looks. A good area to see them up perched where you can see them is like on snaggy trees and things along edges, because they do like to sometimes perch up on the bare sticks. So our next Spizella is the Brewers, and we can think of it as a pale sparrow. It likes open, brushy habitats, and it's often found with the other 2 species during migration around here. And it can be in just small numbers or sometimes some moderate flocks. So what strikes you right away looking at these Brewer sparrows? I see a prominent eye ring that's kind of full. It's uniform. It's all complete. It's not divided by any eye line. The eye line's just behind the eye ring. I also see that the malar is there, but it's not very prominent. And the bird kind of has an overall pale aspect to it. So indeed, they're relatively plain-faced, and the eye ring being prominent is an important mark. They have the pale lores, and the malar stripe is less distinct, and it's often faint. So if you look, for example, in this lower sort of center bird, where my cursor is showing, hopefully, you see a nice prominent eye ring. This guy's got lighting on it that kind of washes it out a bit. You see an eye line behind. The malar's showing a little bit prominently, but these lines are not very solid. Notice they're kind of grayish on the auriculars, or a little bit light tan, but often not really a prominent buffy color. And the supercilium is kind of subdued. So that's our littlest of the sparrows. I love this picture of the juvenile with this big mushroom that looks like it's going to eat it. Beautiful picture by Beat Soleil. The clay-colored is the third of the Spizellas, and it's the contrasty sparrow. It's a prairie sparrow that here along the Front Range, it kind of washes up against our hills, but it really doesn't get up into the mountains. So once you get up away from the edge of the hogbacks and the immediate foothills, then you really don't find the species. But out in the prairie edge and other parts of the metro area, you can find them regularly now. And they overlap with the other species and are often found together in small numbers or moderate flocks. So if you look at this bird, what strikes you is it's very contrasty in its facial pattern. And it has some particular markings there that are much stronger than the other species we look at. We also get kind of some buff tones on the face. We don't get the eye ring prominent. We don't get an eye line prominent. And so this bird has pale lores like the Brewers, unlike the Chippers with its dark lores. But it's a little different than the Brewers, and it's more strongly marked and more contrasty in its pattern. So notice how well defined the malar line is in these images, nice and bright white with contrasting border lines that are fairly dark. And the auriculars are consistently a buff. Now, one thing that's different, and I may have to go back because I didn't point it out, if you look at the left-hand picture, you can see this prominent median crown stripe. That's an important mark for the clay-colored sparrow if you're able to view it at the angle where you can see it. So I'm going to go back up to the Brewers, and you can see on these different birds that there's a little hint of that here, but not much in the lower left, not at all in the upper left, very little showing in this image here that you can still see. So that median crown stripe is a good one for the clay-colored sparrow. So let's have a Spizella recap. That was a really quick tour, but remember, what are your impressions right off the bat? The eye line with the eye arcs for the chipping sparrow, both adult and the juvenile. The Brewer sparrow, eye ring prominent, pale looking. The clay-colored sparrow, contrasty, strong face pattern, Eye-ring not so prominent, but the malar and supercilium much more so. Notice I didn't talk at all about the gray nape. They all three have gray napes, especially the adults. And there's some subtle differences, and this is indeed more contrasty on the clay colored than the others, but that's not really always the most helpful mark to figure on. So we do have some Spizella pro tips. You want to count by 10s and 20s as the flocks are fleshing out, but then you round to the nearest 5 so that your report looks like it's more precise and that you're a better birder. Also, don't report any unidentified Spizella species because that reveals some birding weakness that you have. So go ahead and just identify everything. Don't ever report Spizella spa. When the birds are backlit or far away, then you can confidently call out what is the most expected species. And as the flock departs and goes, then you can say, well, I saw all 3 species, but they just flew. So those are my pro tips. Let's take a look at our 3 Melospiza species. We have the song sparrow, which is resident year-round. You can see its bar in the chart there. It goes all year round, and it's pretty numerous or frequent all year round. And we find that in a lot of different wet habitats. The Lincoln sparrow nests in the mountains. You can see it's got a nice presence through the breeding season, but it has a fall pulse of migrants that's happening right now. We're heading right into it, and has very little presence in the winter, but there are some around, but it's a good bird to find during the winter. The swamp sparrow is different. They arrive in late fall and are present through the winter and then trickle out as we approach spring. And they're rather uncommon as far as it goes, but we'll take a look at that. So the Melospizas, they like a lot of cover, but they pitch up well where you can see them. You got to be ready for that. Take advantage of what you can see. Here's our graph, and you can see some interesting patterns here. The song sparrow is the most numerous, the blue line. Notice this big dip. In the summer, there should be a lot of young birds around and stuff, but indeed the birds get less easy to find as they molt. And so their frequency of detection drops off. And then it picks up as they're done molting, and we probably pick up some other migrants as well. And you have a winter time presence then that's established by mid-fall. We're pretty much at the numbers we have. See a similar pattern here with the Lincolns. Notice the swamp sparrow, much less numerous and coming in later. So song is widespread and common resident in a lot of different wet habitats. They're curious birds, and they'll often come up to view and perch up, and they'll pump their tail as they fly over open areas, like going from a willow across a little patch to another spot. You'll see them pump their tail, and they'll often hold their tail cocked up when they're perched or foraging. So it's a good mark, and it gives them a certain attitude. That's a lot of fun. So what strikes you here is a very heavily streaked bird, and you notice on the face a gray and brown aspect, and central breast spot is prominent. So this is a medium to large sparrow, but the head kind of blends into the body in a lot of postures, as you can kind of see in this lower center picture or even this brighter upper center picture. And there are thick streaks and a wash of buff and gray on the sides. But notice something distinctive on the throat, and this is a great mark at long distances, is this flaring of this lateral throat stripe. And it almost forms like a necklace across as both these flares join together. We could call that a lateral throat stripe flourish or something. And that, together with the central breast spot, gives a particular look to the front of the song sparrow. They'll also often have a nice warm color on the wings or tail, so there's a little bit of kind of rusty color there showing on the wings, even in the shadowed image there. All right, so the rinky-dinky-linky, as I like to call it, is a bird that you find in moist habitats with thick cover. They're very responsive to pitching, though, which is great, because they'll pop up and they're curious, but soon they're going to pop back down and hide, and you can maybe get a glimpse of them, but you take advantage of those views when you get them. And usually we just see them in small numbers, 1 or 2 at a time. So what strikes you right away here? Streaky, buff, and an eye ring that has some prominence, and buff on the malar, streaky and buff, and they're kind of small. You can even get a sense of their kind of daintiness just from these pictures, and I know that many of you have seen them and you know that. So smaller, streaky with a buff aspect. Notice the crown feathers are often a little bit raised, like you can see in the top right bird and the one with the beautiful red leaves here. And So that's often a very distinctive thing that gives them a certain look of curiosity, often, or a little bit of sass. And the buff breast has a nice brand of buff on the breast with short, fine streaks that are confined within the buff. So this is a key mark that's easy to see, and the way that the streaks end where the buff changes to the white. Notice the eye ring is actually broken by the eye line that's back coming from the back part of the eye. And here's a beautiful close-up look at some of the fantastic detail on a Lincoln sparrow head. What a bird. We don't always get to see them like that. So our last Melospiza is the swampy, and indeed they like wet places, often where there's weeds and wetland plants and willows intermingling. And we usually just see one or two, and it's always a treat to find them. The swamp sparrow is a really neat bird. They have a particular shape to them that's kind of like the song sparrow, but a little bit distinctive. Notice the bright coloration on the wing panel here, this bright red on these images where it's nicely lit. That's distinctive for the swamp sparrow, that bold rufous wings. And they look capped. And notice they have a flaring supercilium. It kind of broadens out a little bit towards the back. And underneath that, this eye line flares out into what I call a post-auricular flourish. At the back of the auricular patch, it broadens out. And that's a distinctive pattern for some species, and it is certainly one for the swamp sparrow. So as you're looking at the face, notice it's kind of bland-faced compared to some others, but that is a distinctive feature. The bill is bicolored, and these guys make a little call that's like an eastern phoebe call, and that can be useful because they like to hide down in the marsh, and you can be listening for that call when there shouldn't be any eastern phoebes around. This I want to share. This is the same bird that you have in the upper right here, but this one's back in February. This one is in late April. This guy wintered in my front yard, and look how pretty he gets in his breeding plumage. He even began to sing and would perch up on these junipers, but he's all red here and black and much more pretty on the face. So occasionally we get to see them in late spring when they're gorgeous. The three zonos, or the zonotrichia species, are white-crowned Harrises and white-throated. The white-crowned sparrow is present basically year-round, but it's different subspecies. The mountain form during the breeding season and in the tail end and earlier part of migration, and the gambles coming in now is our winter form that's present through the winter. The Harrises is rather uncommon, and they're kind of late fall migrant, and the white-throated sparrow also similarly uncommon, but with a little pulse in October. If you want to see a white-throated, find one yourself, search one out. October is a good time to be looking. You can see in the graph of all three that the red line of the white-crowned sparrow much more abundant than our two uncommon sparrows. This one has a tree sparrow thrown in. Notice the similarity in frequency between the tree sparrow and the white-crowned sparrow in the metro area during the winter time. Isn't that interesting? So it's good to think about those two species because they actually do look somewhat alike, even though they have some big differences. The zonotrichias are big sparrows. Here's just a focus on the Harrises and the white-throated. The white-throated in red, you can see that October peak. Otherwise, they have very similar patterns and no real spring pattern, but we're not worried about spring. So the white-crowned, we have two different kinds that we can notice as adults. The juveniles look a lot more similar, and I'm not going to go there at all. But we have our Oriantha, or Dark Lord form that we have as a breeder in the mountains, and then in the middle there labeled, and the Gamblii on the left, which is the one that's arriving now and is our common wintering form. You can see the black lores, that area between the eye and the bill, and contrast that with the pale lores, in this case white, on the Gamble's white-crowned sparrow. And we have a lot of singing Oriantha around when they're singing, so usually you can hear several others. I'm up in the high mountain willows, but we're not up in the high mountain willows now for the most part. So what do we notice right away is it's a big, slim sparrow when we see them. They're long-tailed. They have often a little bit of a peak to the rear crown, but notice the strong pattern on the adults and the similar pattern on the young birds. These are easy to identify, the adults. We don't have to worry about them for the most part. but notice the underparts are unstreaked and no breast spot, and the immature bird has a nice kind of buffy forecrown or forehead, and this nice kind of warm brown, bold lateral crown stripes. White-throated sparrow, we're always looking for those. Sometimes they're real easy to tell. Other times they're pretty drab. What strikes you right away is the contrasting light and dark head stripes that go all the way to the back of the nape. And it has kind of a rounded head. And of course, we see that bright white throat on some of these, but sometimes that's a lot duller. And they also all the time have a nice yellow area on the lores. Sometimes it's bright, like on this bottom center bird. Other times it's much duller, like on this juvenile bird that we see above here. You can still see it there, but you can imagine in a dim situation, which is not uncommon for these white-throated sparrows because they like dense cover, that could be hard to see. So this is a big sparrow, and that kind of domed head with its prominent face pattern and the yellow at the lores are consistent. Notice the throat is a white malar and a white throat with some gray borders and often a darker dusky gray border along the lower margin. It can even be kind of blackish on adult birds. The hatchier birds, the young birds, are a little bit streaky underneath, but it's kind of an indistinct and not prominent streaking. The Harris's sparrow, this is my favorite of the bunch probably. We don't see them a whole lot, but we can certainly find them as we get into a little later into fall. They like brushy areas and with dense cover, but open areas near them. They like to come to feeders. And what strikes you right away here is buff and black and a good sized bird with a big bill. And this is the largest and heaviest. The buffs and blacks are prominent. Notice the kind of blank buff face and the large bright bill. So the adults have a bold black crown and throat and necklace, but it can be variable. So there's 3 adults here on the left side. You can see they all look a little bit different. Some a little more peppered with white up here, and some with a lot more extensive black. And then the young birds look different yet. So notice the adults have black throats, the young have white throats, and they have this salt and pepper pattern on the crown and this pale blonde buff face. Very distinctive pattern. The bill is big and pale, so it catches your attention. I like this one with the white-crowned sparrow down below here, and you can really kind of see how that buff, pale face is very easy to see. And sometimes that might be what you're mostly looking at as the bird's peering out through a thicket of stuff. So our last species we're going to consider real quick here is our Spizoiloides, the American tree sparrow. And this is the littlest sparrow, and they are not here for a little while yet. They don't come in till late October, and they're only arriving as the chipping sparrows are on their way out. The other Spizella's long gone, so there's very little overlap between the superficially similar chipping sparrow and the tree sparrow. But some real differences in the tree sparrow. What strikes you is that nice chestnut red crown and eyeline. Notice the post-auricular flourish on the eyeline, this upper left picture, for example, and that the breast has this nice kind of smudgy dark spot. So these are little guys, and one of the neat things about tree sparrows is they often have some tail action going. They're kind of both flicking and spreading their tail at the same time. Very subtle little motion, but you watch them when they perch up, and they're often doing that with their tail. And so even if you get the really poor look backlit, even at a distance, you see that tail action. They're the only ones doing that, and it's not like once or twice. It's frequent. So that's a really good mark for the tree sparrow. So I want to move right into our quizzes. So I hope you're ready to be quizzed. We're going to go kind of quick here because sometimes sparrows don't stay up in view too long. So we're beginning right away with this sparrow. So it's only looking toward us. We can't see its upper parts. What strikes you right away? I'm going to kind of talk us through it, but you can make your initial assessment right now. And we can see that it is basic clear-breasted, plain clear face. We see some bold crown stripes and a eye line that is mostly behind the eye, making some eye arcs, bright bill. What do you think? This is a white-crowned sparrow. So it's an immature white-crowned sparrow, hatchier by the brown coloration, of course, not the bright black and white. Gray face with the gray unstreaked underparts, the eye line with the eye arcs, pale lores, and the bright bill. So now, we have birds peeking out through sticks like sparrows like to do. Now these really aren't that hard though, because you can see some real giveaway marks. First off, we can see the bright white on the throat, right? And so is that easy? This is pretty easy. So I'm giving you guys an easy one here. And the the yellow on the lores is also prominent. What other marks can you see that might be useful? You can only see the crown stripes a little bit, but you can see they're continuing all the way back onto the nape, a little different pattern than on the white-crowned sparrow, and some little faint streaks on the underpart showing on these birds, as does happen on some white-throated sparrows. We don't see any streaks on the white-crowned, for example. So white-throated sparrow adults, bright white throat, malar with dark margins, yellow laurel spot, black and white striped head. Pretty easy. So we have two birds here to consider, but let's focus on the sparrow. Hope everybody knows the left-hand bird. This bird's a little farther away and we can't quite make out some of the details, but even this poor view like we could have in the field, looking out across a road or a parking lot or something like that, we can see this bird has a lot of heavy streaks. It's got a prominent face pattern. Can't see a whole lot, but it looks gray and brown. That's what I see. And I see that tail kind of cocked up. Well, well, well. Mr. Song Sparrow, along with a mallard. Notice that cocked tail, a kind of smashed down head, plump, brown and streaked. You can even see here that flaring lateral throat stripe I was talking about at a distance. In this particular lighting in the image, you can't see the breast spot so much, but that is very distinctive, and it says Song Sparrow all over the place. All right, so that is our mallard. Moving on, here's a bird poking up through the grass. We can't see the whole thing, and it's going to fly away in a moment, so you just have a moment to assess. Well, it's has a particular facial color and a kind of a big beady eye, and look at that salt and pepper head. So it's got that blonde buff face with the big bill, and this is the Harris's sparrow, a Hatchier Harris's white throat as well. So the salt and pepper crown, that post-auricular flourish I was mentioning, you can see here in the picture. That's kind of the prominent thing on their face, is that. And the large bright bill. So here we go. This guy's taking a bath. Sometimes that can make it harder. What do you think? What strikes me is this bird has kind of a dainty look to it. And I see that it's got nice chestnut color on the crown. I see a bicolored bill and a warm colored eye line. Again, you see a little post-auricular flourish there. And I can't see a whole lot about the breast because it's messed up, except I see some buff color along the sides here. And these are distinctive features for the American tree sparrow. So particularly that chestnut color and the bicolored bill, and you would appreciate its small size. And it's also been my observation that they prefer to splash to the left when they're bathing. But got to be careful with that field mark. All right, so here's one, just like you see it out in the field, far away, can't really make out a lot of details, but yes, you can make out some important details. So what do you see? What stands out to me is a buff breast band with some streaking that's in the buff. And there's a spot there, and the face has some buff on the malar. Pretty good pattern. My impression is it's kind of a small bird. It's a Lincoln sparrow. Smaller size, buff breast with the streaks in the buff. That spot in the middle, and the buff you can see on the face there at the malar area, all very good for Lincolns. All right, so this one was kind of hiding away there. And, So maybe it's hard to form an impression about size. I would lean toward smaller rather than bigger. And I notice there's an eye line, and it goes across to the lores, and it splits the eye ring into eye arcs. There's no streaks or marks on the breast. A little bit of a malar. So this is chipping sparrow, basic adult. The eye line with the split eye arcs is a distinctive thing that you see. Those warm brown stripes, the brown auricular patch, the indistinct malar, unstreaked breast. So you can consider here briefly like some contenders The gray upper parts with no marking rules out everything but a Brewer's clay-colored and white-crowned sparrow. The white-crowned we know is bigger. It has dark. It has. I don't know why I put dark lores there because it doesn't. It has a. I'm sorry, but I need to edit that different. So the white-crowned is bigger with pale lores, is what I meant to say, and a different coloration on the crown. And the other Spizellas have pale lores as well, and the don't have the eyeline prominent. All right, so here's a group of Spizellas, speaking of it, and this is a tough group here because they're all moving around. These willows are blowing in the wind. The flock is just flowing up there, and they could leave it any minute. Others are coming in. Some are dropping back down. And oh my goodness, is all these sparrows, and you're trying to point them out and say, oh, that one in the willow to the left there, and nobody can get on the same birds. But you're finally getting a good look, and you got this image that you can study at home even afterwards. So what do we see? We have 5 different birds to identify. One is extra credit. So we have number 1. We see a prominent red cap with a dark eyeline and an unstreaked underparts. Okay, so this looks kind of like a breeding time chipping sparrow. Indeed, it's kind of late in the summer, but it hasn't molted yet. So this is more like the breeding pattern with the more whitish eyebrow and blackish eyeline. You can see the dark lores and the red color there. So indeed, there are 3 Spizellas. I'm sorry, I don't want to go there yet, but I just gave away that all 3 species are here. The chipping adult with the red crown, black eyeline, and no malar really to speak of. Okay, so let's look at number 2 next to it. That bird is we just say it's a lot more streaky, it's a lot more brown. Can you see anything? The crown is brown with fine streaks, and I can just make out some streaks on the breast, kind of hiding here to the left of the crown of the chipper, as we can see just a bit of the breast area there. So that's a hatch-ear chipping sparrow, only streaked small Spizella with the dark eyeline that you can still see even in this picture splitting the eye arcs. All right, and that's a prominent feature actually as you're able to view it in the photo. Oops, didn't want to go to our last one yet, so let me pull that away. So number 3 here, we see Mr. Contrasty with these bold white supercilium and malar stripes and a prominent median crown stripe. The eye ring is not prominent, but the lores are pale, and this is indeed our clay-colored sparrow, that strong face pattern, median crown stripe, bold malar. And so what's next to it there, number 4? It looks paler, but I see the eye ring is prominent, and the malar is less distinct and kind of general, more grayer aspect, less buff. And so the prominent eye ring, complete eye ring, would take us in this group to Brewer's sparrow. Less contrasty face pattern, no median stripe, eye ring prominent. What about extra credit there? Can you see it? Just underneath that Brewer's, you can just see its tail, a bit of wingtips, but you can see the underparts, and what do you see? I see streaking. So I'm going to say a hatch-ear chipping sparrow. All right, so that's a fun group. A little bit of reality slowed down by the picture. And let's take a quick look here. What strikes you right away? Prominent rusty red on the wings, kind of extensive. Not a whole lot else real prominent in this view, but if the bird were to lift its head up, we see it's got an eyeline, a little gray there, the sides of some buff. But it'll help us out now. Here's some of the rest of the bird. And you can see a little bicolored bill, that flourish in the back of the auricular patch. Notice the kind of plump roundness and the squashed in head shape, sort of like a song sparrow. So we're in the Melospiza, and this is indeed a swamp sparrow with its indistinct breast streaks and its post-auricular flourish and that bright red wings. This is in the winter, so they're colored like we see them, not like that bright one I showed you. All right. So this is going to be our last quiz, and you might be saying, wait a minute, where's the birds here? Well, they're a little hard to see. Let's make it a little easier. We'll zoom in up there. This is the same bird in both pictures, a little different view. And what do we see here? Can you see it? Here's the eye on the left picture where my cursor is. And here is the eye, partially hidden by this blade of a cattail, I guess, here on the right picture. So you see where the bird is. So what I can see here is that his crown feathers are raised up, and he's got a little bit of attitude. He's looking out at me. He's got some buff on the breast. It's a little hard to see, but notice it's the same color here as these brown leaves, that buff there. And you can also see a little bit over here, a buff wash with streaks on it, but the streaks don't go down below that buff. So you can see a little bit there. And it's a buff malar and a buff eye-ring. So these things are coming together as Lincoln Sparrow. Buff breast with the fine streaks, the raised crown feathers, buff eye-ring, and gray face with the buff malar stripe. All right, so I want to really thank everybody who contributed photos to make this bird bombs and my other bird bombs possible. There's a list of those who helped out with images for tonight's show. I'm really grateful for their contribution. It's their wonderful images that give me the material to present and give you these great pictures to look at to help you learn more about these species. And so it's easy to be a Bird Bombs photo contributor. If you take pictures and you use eBird, I can easily access your images. So let me know that that's okay with you, and I will tell you a little bit more about that. Very straightforward. So you can view past bird bombs on our DFO webpage, dfobirds.org. Go to the Programs button and then choose Past Programs, and you can get to all of our past bird bombs. The next one's coming up on October 13th. 7 p.m. and we're going to be looking at loons, and hopefully in real life we'll be looking at some loons too as we get into late fall. Great time to be looking for these birds that are not common, but they are out there, and we can follow other people's reports or we can find our own, and we'll know what to look at as we're looking at loons with our next bird bombs. So I'm going to stop the share and we'll go to any questions and comments or anything like that. We're going a little long, sorry everyone, but I had 10 species to deal with there.
No worries. Yeah, thanks. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A feature there, probably at the bottom of your screen, or you can chat them to me and I'll pick them up there. My first question for you is, we talked a little bit about clay-colored sparrows being more prairie species. We've got our two different white-crowned species. Are there other habitat sort of differences that we should be really paying attention to for these sparrows?
Well, they all have their particular likes, even in migration when things can turn up in different places and all that. For the most part, they still have their preferences. And so with the, for example, the three Melospiza species are looking for wet areas. So if you want to search out a Lincoln sparrow, you can look for like wet, weedy areas, not dry, weedy areas. You might find one there, but your odds are going to be better where they really want to be. So those kind of differences are good. But for some of them, like the Spizellas, they mix it up a lot as they're moving through, and they literally are moving through the region. And so you can kind of see them in any habitat, but you won't see clay-colored sparrows in a forest or up in the mountains. You know, they do pick grassland a lot. That's definitely their preference. And the Brewers, just like you see them in the breeding season and like sagebrush scrub, well, they like kind of scrubby areas, dry sort of areas in migration as well. So the habitat considerations are really important.
Awesome. Yeah. Are there any other species that you didn't talk about tonight? Any other species of sparrows that we should be on the lookout for, check out in our field guide before we go out to know not to mistake those?
Yeah, next fall we'll do the rare fall sparrows bird bomb, but there are some common ones still now that you can see just a little bit later into the season still: the Vesper sparrow, the lark bunting. And one other is prominent, is the Savannah sparrow, but those guys will be trailing off soon. But there are the golden crown sparrow is a real possibility, particularly as we get a little later into fall, late October onward. And we'll just get one or two or a handful that'll be found in the greater metro region or along the Front Range, but it's one to know about. Couldn't go there tonight. There are a number of much rarer species that could turn up in the metro area along the Front Range. But there's a lot of species to mention there. We just found one in Gilpin County, Front Range, a black-throated sparrow on a DFO trip just a few days ago. So you can take a look at the state list on the CFO page and and see some of the other rare species. Then there's some ones that you could encounter out on the prairie more. If you want to find a field sparrow, which is a rare, but they do occur, you want to get out far east as far as you can, better odds. Or a Cassin sparrow, which are still some around, you would find out in the prairie area, more away from the metro region.
Nice. Yeah. Always get excited when I get to see a golden crown sparrow there. Jan has a really great question. Do any of these sparrows that we talked about tonight appear at our bird feeders?
Yeah, that's the fun thing about sparrows is you hope springs eternal as you look at the feeders at this time of year during the winter, because yes, there are interesting sparrows. Things like the white-throated and the Harrises are most often probably seen at feeders, particularly in the wintertime when they're settling in spots. But that's a great place to find those species. Any of the sparrows really can appear at feeders because they're attracted just like other birds. So almost any of these, keeping in mind that the ones that like the densest cover are maybe least frequent, but maybe your yard has some nice cover. So I see Lincoln sparrow in my kind of regular landscape yard because there's some nice dense shady spots and they're attracted where the seed is. So it's great to watch your feeders. And sometimes that can be most of what you can do for your sparrow watching.
Nice. Kind of on a similar topic, you talked about the cover in your yard. Do you know planting native plants in your yard? Does that help attract any of these in particular? Any thoughts
Sure.
there?
Yeah, native plants. I mean, shrubby sorts of things that we see, like rabbit brush and all that, are things that sparrows like. They provide cover and even some foraging resources. Um, and Even small trees in a landscape provide good cover and is the kind of habitat that a lot of migrant sparrows are looking for. So you want to have like dense hedges are really good, shady spots underneath the hedgerow, underneath shrubs, where there's dense vegetation down close to the ground level. Those are kinds of things to attract sparrows. And have a water feature if you can. It's not always possible, but at least a bath or something. It's always important.
Cool. Yeah. Do you know types of seed at your feeders? Do sparrows like any particular type of seed over another? Any
Uh,
ideas there?
I say millet is a favorite, but they
Millet?
also like sunflower seed,
Yeah.
but millet is a prime.
Sweet. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that is all of the questions. Oh, I do have one more question for you. Last question. It's going to be nice and cool on Sunday here in the metro area. Where should I be going to look for sparrows?
Yeah, well, DFO has a field trip on Sunday going to Bear Creek Lake Park, and we're going to be looking for
Nice.
sparrows on that trip. So there's still a few, I think there's a few spaces open. And other DFO trips would be good for that. But what I would suggest is think about larger open areas that have shrubby margins or stream corridors going through them. Think about that wet, weedy willows combination. Those are the kind of places to be looking. Right now, anywhere there's moisture, since it's so warm, we're going to have a little moisture maybe this weekend, but in general, places where there's some moisture are good places to look. The migrants like those areas. They have a lot of insects. The plants are going to seed now or have seeds. So if you're in the state parks, like around the creek mouths, I always am promoting those, but those are lively spots. So those kinds of places are good.